Okay. Okay. Welcome, everyone, to the Trek Friday Transportation Seminar. Today we'll be hearing from Amy Lubitow, a professor here in the School of Sociology. Amy?
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. It's nice to see some familiar faces. I'm going to talk today. I think this talk's about 35 minutes or so. If you want to interrupt or ask a question, please do. I don't mind at all. I'm going to talk a little bit about this project that started, I think, in the fall of 2015. Dylan Mahmoudi, who some of you may know, is in urban studies and planning, and he was a really active part of this process and really helped out with specifically the GIS work that we'll talk about. So if you have any really hard questions about GIS, you might have to hold them for Dylan. But I'm going to kind of give you an overview of how this project worked and give you some, I think, things to think about in terms of equity here in Portland. I put it up here, but ISS here on campus funded this project, and it was specifically to be a kind of collaboration between faculty here at PSU and the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. So I'll tell you a little bit. These are just folks I should thank. My research team, I had a lot of really fantastic graduate students who helped out with this process. None of them are here, but they're lovely. So the project itself, the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, I think probably many of you know, have this proposed Green Loop project down here in the central city. I've got a couple of slides I'll show you, but it's a specific kind of cycling infrastructure that the city wants to implement down here. And so they were interested in understanding a little bit more, how do we make this an equitable space? How do we understand equity around a piece of cycling infrastructure in the central city? And I kind of, at that point in time, I had a really nice relationship. I still have a nice relationship with folks in the city. And we talked through this process, and I kind of pushed back and said, you know, I think some of the larger questions about equity and cycling spaces might be more interesting if we talk about the east side of Portland, if we talk about north and northeast Portland. And so we agreed at that point in time to kind of expand the scope of this project and to really understand what makes it challenging and difficult for people to move around in their own spaces in their neighborhoods outside of the central city. So we reframed this instead of how do we make the Green Loop equitable, and really started thinking about how do we increase active transportation outside of the downtown area, how might mobility barriers persist in certain parts of Portland, particularly north, northeast, and southeast Portland, and then how can the city kind of tap into some things that are already happening in those neighborhoods and try and learn from momentum that's occurring around active transportation outside of the central city. So again, this is the Green Loop. This is one of the city's conceptual drawings. But if you take a look, right, the Willamette is in the middle, and this loop is, I think, maybe somebody knows better than I do, about 6-ish miles that's proposed of cycling infrastructure, more accessible pedestrian spaces, and it's supposed to kind of connect the east and the west sides, making a kind of more accessible downtown space. Just the update, the Green Loop is kind of going through this design phase where people are trying to figure out what should it look like, how do we get funding for it, that sort of thing. So to give you, I think, some kind of larger context here as well, the Portland Climate Action Plan, which was kind of part of this discussion about climate change and public spaces and bicycling facilities, has some very specific goals around increasing active transportation. So the specific goals are that 90% of Portland residents can easily walk or bike to meet all basic daily non-work needs. And if you take a look at this report, it's a complete neighborhoods report that came from the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. In 2015, 40% of Portlanders live in neighborhoods that don't actually meet that kind of criteria. They're not complete neighborhoods. So you can't just hop on a bike or hop on public transportation to get to work or to get to the public library or to get to the grocery store. So we were tying these all together, I think, to try and understand kind of what are the environmental benefits of something like the Green Loop, and how do different groups of people lack access to that in some kind of specific way when we think about neighborhoods in a much broader context. So what we did for this project, we specifically wanted to do some qualitative work in neighborhoods, talking to people about how they move, what they have challenges with, and to try and gather as much information as possible about what might inspire people to get out and to use public transit more often, or to ride bikes more often, or to just get out and walk around. So what we did, we identified, we were specifically interested in neighborhoods that were either experiencing or at risk of gentrification. So we borrowed from a report that Lisa Bates did with BPS in 2013, and we really tried to target the outreach that we did in neighborhoods that were much more likely to be vulnerable, and with the express goal that we would try and oversample for lower income individuals and for racial and ethnic minorities. So in the end, we did 8 focus groups, 1 in Kenton, 2 in the Cully neighborhood, 1 in Powellhurst-Gilbert, 1 in Montevilla, 2 in the Hazelwood Centennial neighborhood, and 1 in Lentz. So I really like to do qualitative research. I like to have conversations with people. I like to talk to them. And so that was really a specific goal in this particular approach, was to do focus groups. Some of the different ways and some of the things I think were really valuable about this project were that we tried to partner with community organizations and try to directly work with folks and say, hey, how do we access the people that you serve? I think oftentimes there's just sort of these random calls that come out like, hey, we're going to do research. You should participate, random people in the neighborhood. But I think when you kind of cultivate relationships with community organizations, there's a much greater likelihood that people, especially more vulnerable people, are going to come to the table. They're going to want to discuss things if it's at the community center that they go to or it's at an organization they already feel comfortable with. We also did a lot of recruitment for these focus groups at public libraries and public spaces that lots of different people would go to or have access to. And so the research sites themselves, what we would do is kind of go in either with a partnership with the library or with the community organization, and we would have a 2.5-hour focus group. We would talk to people about what makes it hard to get around, and then we did a community mapping exercise. So we would tailor a specific large-scale map, like you can see there, to each neighborhood, and we would ask people to do a number of different exercises with us, kind of thinking about how they move through space, what do they do in any specific given week. So those took about 2.5 hours. I think I covered all this. We did a fair amount of online outreach as well, but I think because we were very specifically interested in lower income and racial and ethnic minorities, that doesn't tend to always be the most successful way to recruit people to participate. So most of our participation really came from actually getting out and just hanging out in neighborhoods and talking to people. Oop, I was hoping I had a different slide. Sorry, folks. So the other thing I'll briefly say is that we did do a number of focus groups in Spanish. We did 2 in Spanish. In the Lentz neighborhood, the community organization we were working with asked us to host a bike ride and help people bike through the neighborhood and then participate in a focus group. So in some ways, this is a less than traditional approach to doing this work because we really took our cues from what the community organizations we worked with wanted. And so when we were setting up to do some of these exercises, we gave people handouts of specific questions for them to think about. One of the most common kind of first exercises we would do is say, hey, where do you go in a typical week in your life? Just here's a couple of different sticky dots, stick them on this map, and show us everywhere that you go. We tagged those to their demographic characteristics, so we would ask them to fill out a face sheet that had all of their racial background, gender, your household income, your level of education. So we could then kind of start to put together a picture of how are different people moving through space in different ways. These are just some fun little bar charts for you. In our approach in trying to really get a diverse sample, we were very successful. We had a majority of participants being racial or ethnic minorities, and we had folks who were, on average, much lower than the median household income here in Portland. We had a pretty broad range of ages here. And a pretty wide variety of educational attainment as well. I know it might be hard to see this, but this is 18 to 34, 35 to 54, 55 and over, and then we've got a range of different educational outcomes over there. This one's hard to see. We've felt really strongly about doing this, and this is sort of our preparation for writing a paper on this work, but we did want to kind of connect up how representative were each of these focus groups of the neighborhood that we actually held them in. So we did take a look at some of the census info and tried to kind of pair that up. What we find in all of the places we did these focus groups is that we oversampled to the extent that we were hoping to. Yes, so again, this mapping activity, which I'll be showing you some of the maps that we've developed from the activities, but I'm also going to highlight some of the qualitative findings and tell you some of the specific challenges people identified. But typical questions for the demographic or the mapping exercise are, where do you go in a typical week? What places might you specifically avoid? What makes it hard for you to get to where you need to go? And then we would ask about barriers to downtown, because we were still really interested in, if the green loop is built, how likely are you to think about going to that space or using that particular space? So that's what one finished version looks like. So we would have people, it was supposed to be, like a fun social activity. People talked, people joked around what they like to do in their neighborhoods. We did a lot of help, kind of helping people identify, here's where the grocery store is. If there's any questions, we did have some specific struggles about the particular map that we created and how difficult it is for many people to visually understand a map like this. So I'd love questions on that if you want to talk about it afterwards. So again, the data analysis that we did here on these interviews, in sociology we talk about inductive coding a lot, so really just looking at the discussions that came up in the focus groups, coding for them to see what kind of really interesting themes or kind of consistent concepts came up across many of the focus group discussions, and then we have this GIS work that goes with it. So this is every single one of the dots that people placed. Dylan was real excited about making this map. And I would also point out, he's not here, but he had to peel off every single one of these stickers if they were on top of each other. So it was a lot of a labor of love on his part. But it's been really, really helpful to have these maps and to kind of be able to play with them in GIS. One thing we're working on that we haven't quite figured out what to do with yet, so if anybody has ideas, we would love them. Since we collected all the demographic information on folks in the GIS mapping exercise, we're able to take a look at each individual and kind of look at some of the demographic differences across groups. So we know that there are specific differences between how men and women are talking about moving through spaces. So what we found is, visually we're still playing with these, so I guess give us advice, please. But what we find here is that women kind of have a much wider range of trips that they're taking, but it's a much smaller space that they're taking them in. So spatially, we're talking about men traveling bigger distances than women do, but women kind of reporting a more frequent kind of neighborhood trip. So we're interested in playing with those demographic differences, and we also know that there's some specific differences amongst age groups and among racial groups. So it's not a huge sample. I think we have 87 people total, but it's still kind of interesting to start thinking about how do we spatially look at some of these differences. Yeah, some other charts and visualizations we're playing with. Again, we haven't quite figured out what we want to do and kind of how to theoretically link it up to previous research, but we're working on it. But what I do want to talk to you about specifically that we have really kind of solidified is just kind of looking at these disparities of where do people actually go. If we're talking to lower income and racial and ethnic minority folks in Portland, where are they going? If they live on the east side, are they coming downtown to the central city? So this exercise highlights the data points where people say, here's where I go on any given week. We've got 1 to 7 points that they can put down. And so what we really see here, and I think what this shows us, is that almost all of the travel that's happening is happening on the east side of the river. People are not typically coming from their neighborhoods into the central city. And in fact, we found, even when we kind of take a look at this, it's overwhelmingly that people, 88.6% of folks that we spoke with did not report traveling to destinations on the central city side of things. So people not only are not necessarily traveling down here, but as I'll point out in the qualitative interviews or the focus group data, people said we don't feel comfortable, we don't want to go down to the central city. So there's kind of these larger, potentially there's some specific infrastructure barriers or public transportation barriers, but there's also kind of a social or cultural dynamic that's happening as well. We have I'll show you a couple of other GIS maps that we have been working with. Some of the barriers to downtown were identified here. And what I thought was most striking is that when I went to talk to people, I thought, hey, these are all going to be on the east side. People are going to say the barriers to downtown are the bus stop in my neighborhood or the traffic on 84. And I was really, really surprised to find that almost all of the barriers where people stuck this is what makes it hard for me to go downtown or actually downtown. It's a lot of discussions, as I'll highlight, about parking, about not necessarily feeling welcome or safe in the central city, and overall just kind of concerns about what it is that people would want to do down here. So I'll highlight what some of that narrative data looks like in just a minute. Just now. So the barriers for some of this downtown travel that we thought were really important to pay attention to are about traffic congestion, affordability, biking infrastructure, and then broader safety concerns. So some of our participants talked about paying for parking, and these focus groups are really interesting because I think the beauty of a focus group is that it's not just a one-on-one interview. You've got a room full of people who laugh or who gesture or who show you that they agree with the person who's speaking. And so everybody kind of laughs at this one where the person says, I would rather park on the east side of the river and walk over the bridge if I'm going to go downtown. And so everybody laughed at that and thought, yes, that's true. We also have, we didn't specifically ask people to participate if they were bikers or cyclists, but we had a number of folks who participated in these discussions, and so a couple of people really pointed out the lack of consistency in bike lanes getting from their neighborhoods into the central city, so that if they wanted to bike from Kenton or they wanted to bike from Montevilla, it's not a connected or easy or accessible space. And there was a lot of, in Kenton, a number of different people who did bike participated in that group and said it's really hard from Kenton. We're really isolated here, and the buses that come are relatively infrequent, and you can't, bike downtown and then hope that you're going to be able to take the bus home. That it's sometimes very difficult to get the, the volume of people who might be interested in biking and busing, given the services that we have. These are accounts of the barriers to mobility. And so we were visualizing that as anything that makes it hard for you to move around your neighborhood. What makes it hard for you to get to the store or to get to your kid's school. And so, of course, we kind of find these things sprinkled around on the east side. Most of the barriers that people reported, unlike going to downtown where you've got those barriers clearly in the central city, here we've got a really wide range of barriers to overall mobility. A large concern for many people, especially in East Portland, was a lack of sidewalks. Specifically, two different folks kind of highlight in this interview here. This woman says, there's no sidewalks, it's so sketchy, and it's just a short amount of time, but I feel so scared when I'm walking on that because I'm so close to traffic. And if you're walking before the sun comes up, it's dark. So we've got people really talking about just a lack of feeling, or a feeling of kind of fear, concerns about traveling, especially when there's not adequate lighting. And the third respondent said sidewalks aren't really an issue because there aren't any here. And that was another one that everybody laughed at. He said, my wife is blind with a cane, and it's pretty hard to navigate around there when everything looks the same. So that's a big issue for her. And this man went on to talk about the fact that he and his wife really can't do anything actively in their neighborhood because they just don't have the facilities or the accessibility they need. There are a range of concerns that kind of clustered around not only the lack of sidewalks, but just that sort of like connection between people's homes and schools, and just a real challenge in figuring out, if your kid does want to ride a bike or you want to let them ride a bike to school, that there's some significant challenges in many neighborhoods in parents feeling that that's a safe activity or that that's something that they're comfortable with. Additionally here, we had a number of folks talking again about bike facilities that are poorly connected and poorly maintained, not just getting from their neighborhood into the central city, but just in getting around their own neighborhoods. We had a lot of people identifying the fact that the bike lanes itself in many of the neighborhoods, people talked about having to bike down really fast-moving traffic. So if you're out at like 122nd, the speed limit there is 40 miles per hour. So folks are saying, yeah, we have some painted bike lanes, but it is not the kind of bike lane that you necessarily want to bike in on a regular basis, particularly if it's nighttime. So some real challenges were identified there in terms of the facilities that exist and the just lack of safe feeling or safe ridership that people experienced. And kind of broadly speaking, through a number of different research studies I've done, there's consistent findings that people want to see more lighting and just be more visible when they're waiting for buses, when they're waiting for the MAX. So we did do two focus groups in Spanish, and in both of those focus groups, discussions about public transportation and feelings of discrimination, racism emerged in those discussions, and people felt really strongly that there was enough of that the way that they had been treated on public transportation was enough of a deterrent that they might not necessarily always choose the bus. They might prefer to walk. They might prefer to drive. So maybe I'll just read the second one here. This one says, I was leaving the store right across the street. An American lady came walking by me. She started to signal for the bus stop. The bus stop was where I was standing. So the bus stopped for her, and then when I crossed the street to also get on the bus, since the bus driver saw a Mexican person running to get on the bus, she didn't stop. It's something like discrimination for us Hispanics. Not all. Some bus drivers are really nice, but some are really mean. They prefer their own race. So the discussion here happened and kind of revolved around other people's experiences that were similar, feelings of not being respected or treated equally on public transit, and that people saw that, again, as a deterrent to their use of those kinds of facilities. Affordability, especially since we were talking to many different low-income individuals, we heard a lot of people talking about just a lack of affordability for many of these options. Like going downtown is expensive. If you're going to park, that's expensive. If you're going to use public transit, that can be very, very expensive for many families. So I really love this quote here because this person's connecting active transportation to a range of things. But she says, I look at public transit as another social deterrent. You have a Fred Meyer, but Fred Meyer's is more expensive, so you have to go to Winco. And when you're looking at those things, like the fares, and you're on the bus, and it's cold, and you have kids, and you're going to say, I'm not going to go to the store. So you have this convenience store, and you're losing a lot more than you're actually gaining. So, I mean, I think that that's intentionally designed like that. So she talks about just the entire kind of neighborhood environment she lives in is really not conducive to making healthy choices, to active transportation, and that affordability is certainly part of that. The upper quote there did many of the barriers that people put on the mapping exercise were really clustered around transit centers in a couple of places. People saying they didn't feel safe at the transit center platforms due to lack of lighting or lack of kind of safe spaces there. So again, this is just to reiterate this barriers to mobility piece, where most of these barriers to getting around, to being able to move, to being active, are on the east side of the river. So always an interesting kind of concluding part of many of these discussions, which is asking people, okay, so there is this green loop thing. I can tell you about it. I can talk a little bit about what it looks like, and then asking them to kind of assess, like, is this something you would use? How do you see this? Is this something that you, in your neighborhood, how do you respond to this kind of idea? And so this person says, I feel like downtown already gets a lot of love, and I know that there are needs. They're talking about a specific street, Greeley Ave, and I know the city is aware of that, and why that's not prioritized is not clear to me. Over here, this is everybody's favorite. They kind of need to stop paying attention to downtown. Everybody laughed. So investing in the central city is not necessarily going to encourage you to go down there more. And the respondent said no, and then another respondent said it's just going to piss us off. It's magnifying inequity in the city. The city's so inequitable, it really is. So I had many of these discussions during the focus groups, and inevitably there was this feeling in all of the groups that the city was not equitably contributing or investing in many of these neighborhoods. People didn't feel like they had a way to communicate with many planners or city officials. So there was a lot of concern about how decisions were being made. And I think more interest in specifically targeted investments in neighborhoods throughout the city. So here people kind of reflected on wanting to have more information about public engagement processes, wanting to know better about how they can get involved. Not everybody had access to email or to the internet on a regular basis in their homes. So I think they were kind of concerned about how do we get involved, how do we know when these things happen or how these decisions get made. And then we had people who, in trying to think about how do they, get investment in their neighborhoods and kind of see the spaces that they want to see, they talked about wanting to revitalize neighborhoods across the city through small business loans and really investing in specific neighborhoods in a more commercial or business-related way. Okay, who knows who are these goats? Who are the goats? Yeah. Yes. So what's the story with the Belmont goats? They used to live on Belmont. What happened to them? They got gentrified out of Belmont, and they live in Lentz. And even Lentz, they had one plot of land, and they've moved to another. But the kind of closing that I would have in all of these discussions was that I would ask people to tell me everything that wasn't working and what was making everything hard and challenging. And then I would say, hey, but what do you want to see? Like, what would make you happy? What does your neighborhood need? Or can you point to something that is really successful? And in Lentz, everybody was really obsessed with the goats. And I thought it was really telling. People kind of said, I have a favorite goat, and it's, named this. And I think that these goats are this really, really great metaphor for what it is that people want in their neighborhoods. It's not about goats per se, but it's about what goats represent. It's something that's cheap. It's a free resource in the community. You can walk to it. You can go there with friends. It's not necessarily something you have to pay to do, and it gets you outside. It gets you moving. And so I think that this kind of, to me, demonstrates the fact that what I think most people want are not multi-million-dollar investments in neighborhoods. People want small things that make them feel connected, that help them build community, that make them feel kind of attached to a particular place. And so yes, everybody needs sidewalks, but at the same time, I think that we can kind of start smaller. If it's not feasible to build new sidewalks in every neighborhood, or any sidewalks in some neighborhoods, I think starting with these kinds of ideas about placemaking and thinking about what it means to live in a neighborhood. And so I think that some of the folks really sum this up very well. Into trying to get us to think about the fact that it's not just funneling people from outside into the central city and back again. And this respondent said, well, that sort of goes against what my understanding of planning and sustainability promotes, which is living in the neighborhood or living fully in the neighborhood that you call home. Other things that came up really briefly, that we can talk and have a discussion, were just this idea of 20-minute neighborhoods. People are aware across the city of this notion of a 20-minute neighborhood, which is going back to that climate action plan idea that everybody can get to the grocery store, to work or school, within this kind of 20-minute time frame. And so people were aware of this, and they said, yeah, like that's great. We want that. We want that too. But there has to be some kind of investments for us to be able to get to that point. And so they said, this was out at a community center at 162nd and Stark, and people said, we would love some of that stuff out there. We want traffic to move slower. We want to go outside and meet our neighbors, and it's not necessarily happening yet. And then the final quote here were that people, during many of these discussions, I think were really excited about talking to their neighbors and engaging on these issues. And they said, things can change. People are what changes things. You know what I'm saying? So it takes more than one person to say something. This person was trying to rally everybody and said, you guys, we have to come together. So I thought that that's to me very inspiring, and that people know what they want to see in their neighborhoods. They want to get out and engage and think creatively about how to use spaces. But the findings, I think, as they might relate to investments in the central city, suggest that because so many participants in this study, so some of our most vulnerable Portlanders, did not report traveling downtown in a typical week. 2/3 of them don't come down to the central city. And additionally, I think that a lot of people don't necessarily perceive the Green Loop as something that would be for everybody, that they would all have equal access to. We do know that there are some demographic differences in these patterns that we're going to try and take a look at in the future. And that most participants experience multiple different kinds of barriers to their daily mobility. That's both related to unsafe infrastructure, issues of affordability. There's ongoing concerns about the inequitable distribution of city resources. But to sum this up, I think residents want their neighborhoods to thrive. They have clear ideas about how to enhance livability while also maintaining economically and racially diverse communities. So I think there's a lot of opportunities here that discussions around the Green Loop represents. A couple of folks in this room are part of some of the work that is happening in Lentz around building a green ring, so kind of related cycling infrastructure, but out in East Portland. So I think that those are sort of the places where I think that maybe there's room to grow and room to kind of move in that direction. Yeah, so I think I've summed this all up. Let's talk. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Yeah. What's your name?
My name is Anwar Mohammed. So from your study, you explained how to discuss the idea of green loop for people, but there is no more information. Just have green loop, and that's it. What's the furniture of that green loop? What is something that people can use it rather than use public transportation options? Because, for example, if I change myself from running a car to riding a bike, then how much I will consume from cars emission, and that's a health concern. Plus, if I have kids, what is the barrier that I can take them with me without having kids?
Yeah.
So kind of more information about the traffic, how the furniture of this green loop to be, so people can like the idea.
Yeah, so the Green Loop specifically?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot that can be done, I think, to make the Green Loop more accessible and inviting to folks. I think that some of the things that I might suggest would probably link to days where public transportation is free, so families can come down here, or incentivizing the use of the bike share bikes, so that families can ride public transportation, come down here and use the bicycle, and then be able to get home and do that in an affordable way. I think, though, that right now I think the Green Loop is sort of still on that initial trying to figure out what it looks like, what is that design going to be. But I think that there hopefully are some really clear opportunities for how to engage multiple different populations. I think that this study as well, I'm still working with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, and they're very specifically trying to think about, they have this really great slide that they've developed, but they talked about this idea where I think this project has really shifted them from thinking, well, it's just about getting people from outside the central city to come down here and go back again. And now they're trying to identify, so like the green ring and Lentz and then sort of other cycling infrastructure that's out on the east side. How can we start connecting those across spaces instead of just building the greenways that come from the east across the river? I don't know if that answered your question, but insights? Yeah.
Yeah.
Karina Overman, you mentioned the bike share. I was wondering, I can't remember when you were doing these interviews.
It was right before bike share.
Okay, I was wondering what the perception of the bike share was, or if you had done any mapping with bike share and demographics.
I didn't, because when we started this project, I think the bike share was
Just about to be rolled out. I think that one of the challenges here is that the bike share facilities are not you're not super well distributed into the east parts of Portland. And so I think that lots of folks, I don't even know if people are necessarily aware that it's something that it exists, because there's not a lot of the parking stations once you're getting past 82nd or so. Yeah. Yeah, Aaron.
I don't know how much you've engaged with the smart cities planning. How do you see some of those innovations intersecting with some of the needs and desires here?
It's a good question.
I don't know if you want to describe what it is, or
Yeah, so I'm not a smart cities expert by any means, but sort of thinking about how to use like different kinds of technologies and different kinds of smart and innovative resources in order to get people. I think using different kinds of transportation, shifting modes away from carbon-intensive modes of transportation. Yeah, that's accurate assessment.
This push, the city has a planning process where looking at distributed sensors around air quality and congestion and parking and a bunch of other things.
Yeah.
It's beyond, I'm not very involved. But
Yeah.
No, but I think that there's a lot of opportunity. I mean, I think that there's some, at like kind of basic, like really basic infrastructure level, I think that being able to kind of give, and the city does this to some degree with like potholes, right? You can there's like apps and there's different ways in which you can sort of say like, there's a pothole here, like come fix this. And I kind of feel like it would be fantastic if there was something like that for bus facilities and transit stops, and sort of being able to identify like, hey, the light's out here, or this is not a safe space right now. Can somebody come like put in a garbage can in a seat and give us a light? So thinking about some of the ways in which that's a pretty easy one, but I think that those are some of the things where I feel like people's needs are some of the most basic needs that aren't being met, and that there's a way that could enhance that. I think that there's probably some additional ways in which we could think about using different sorts of technologies to plan out, like how do people move. So, we've got these kind of GIS data that are, they're only as good as how well people understand that map or how likely it is that they recall where they've been. But I think it would be really, really interesting to be able to use more accurate data using GPS or other technologies to better track how are people moving, where are they going, where can we maybe put investments that have the most impact, whether that's a different transit center or improved bus stop or something like that. Kelly.
Great talking to me. One of the things that I think about when you were talking about your findings and the quotes that people were giving you about their concerns is how different do you think those are in those communities versus the rest of Portland?
So as compared to maybe more affluent parts, yeah. I think that some of the identification of problems might happen in the same way, where I think people, even in like the Laurelhurst neighborhood, are probably like, hey, we want more bike lanes, we want more lighting. So I think that many of the dynamics are probably the same, but I would sort of suggest that the infrastructure right now, kind of east of 82nd, is so inferior as compared to what happens kind of in the central city, that it's hard sometimes to sort of say, well, you're talking about similar things, but they're totally different. So this, people are going 40 miles per hour down a really big kind of 2 or 4 lane road, and so that's a kind of different level of discomfort or fear around riding your bike than I have to share the road with lots of people who are sitting in traffic. So I think that they're related, but very different in terms of scale or in terms of what the intervention to increase active transportation, east of 82nd would be.
Yeah, I find in a lot of my qualitative work that when you're looking at responses across income groups, that they often articulate some things using the same language, and then it's harder to sort of differentiate degree. I think one of the big differences here is maybe talking about those cultural differences or not feeling like one belongs might not be something that comes up in more affluent neighborhoods.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I thought it was really interesting. I think that there are a lot of really, really great amenities in the central city that, OMSI and art museums and fun spaces, but those, again, are a specific income group, a specific kind of racial or ethnic background really identifies with those spaces as being places you want to go to more than lots of other people do. I think that what is interesting, we only kind of gave people on these maps spaces to kind of, within the Portland city limits, place their dots, and then we would just kind of put little side categories for different suburbs. But there's a huge amount of activity that's happening outside. People are going to Gresham and to Beaverton and to Hillsborough much more often, I think, than they were going into the central city. We didn't do a great job collecting that information. We just sort of took some notes around it and kind of cataloged that was happening. But I think it's much more likely people are doing shopping in Beaverton. They're going to other places where they maybe feel more comfortable. The Pioneer Place is not something that everybody necessarily wants to go shopping at. Oh, yeah.
How did you get participation? So what were some of the mechanisms?
Oh, yeah. So again, I can't understate enough how really helpful it was to work with 3 specific community organizations. But we did offer food, childcare. We offered $25 gift cards to people that participated. And in the focus groups that were done in Spanish, I don't speak Spanish very well, so I trained people in the neighborhood to actually help to facilitate those groups with a graduate student. So that was, I think, really helpful in getting a lot of the people who helped lead the focus groups then got people to come to those focus groups in particular. But yeah, out at the Rosewood Initiative, we had to turn people away because there was just too many people who wanted to participate in that space. Yeah.
Hi, Robert Brodowski. You showed a map earlier that I was interested in, the gentrification risk map.
Yeah.
I got a couple questions. One, did you make that
I
map?
did not. So Lisa, based in urban studies, works on a research project with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, and they actually rank a number of different risk factors. The report you can get, so it's a 2013 report. You could get it from the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability website, and I think Lisa is the author, so she's the main author. I really recommend taking a look at it.
Yeah, so I was wondering, I guess, what the risk factors were, which I could probably look at, but also, was that a topic that came up in your discussions,
Yes.
gentrification?
Yes.
Quite a bit, I might think.
Yeah.
And do you think that lack of maybe transit to downtown might be related to the fact that they aren't gentrified as much at this point?
Yeah. Sure. I do recommend taking a look at this. This is some of the risk factors relate to like different demographic variables and how expensive is the rent in those areas, how accessible is it to public transit. I can't remember all of the different risk factors, but I do encourage you to look at that report. But I think certainly that's a part of this story, right? That people who live in, outside 162nd and Stark, where the Rosewood Initiative is, being able to take the light rail from there to the central city is at least an hour. It doesn't, it comes every 15 minutes, but it's still a long way to travel to come downtown. The bus service out there also takes a long time if you're trying to get to the central city. So I think that's part of the story of gentrification, right? People are less likely to move into neighborhoods that are less transit rich, but at the same time, I think we're still kind of looking at a situation in Portland where we have to think a little more creatively about the people who currently live here and trying to kind of meet everybody's basic needs for wanting to be active in their neighborhoods. And I think we have this conversation in Lentz a lot, like, we want to invest in neighborhoods and make them affordable without or making them livable without having necessarily sacrifice affordability for people. And so I think it's it's a tension, I think, in many neighborhoods. It's not a great answer. Sorry. Yeah.
So I have a question on the gender differences. So the violin maps or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, that really fits with what I think, lots of research about kind of travel chefs and women doing more trip training and all that. So I was just wondering, did that come up in the qualitative work about how women are, like, how they deal with that? Like, are they more likely to borrow a car so they can do those trip training? Are they more likely to shop at big box stores?
Yeah, and, I think some of this varied from neighborhood to neighborhood, interestingly, but I think it was kind of like, a lot of this is about, like, space, right? How close is the grocery store? How close do you live to your neighbors who maybe have a car? And so I think that, I was not surprised by many of these findings because, as you said, there's kind of this established notion about gender and mobility and the fact that women are much less likely to sort of be these active commuters. They're going to stop off to go to the store or to attend to children, drop people off or pick people up. So I can't remember what your question was, Tara.
Or did it come up with the qualitative how they, what are the ways that people deal with that?
Yeah. It was really interesting. So I started on this by saying it's kind of different by neighborhood to neighborhood. So in the Cully neighborhood where we did 2 focus groups, a lot of the women there just kind of had them. It's really interesting. We look at them group by group. In that neighborhood, the women's mobility was really, really, really tiny. Like most of them didn't really even leave the neighborhood, so they walked almost everywhere that they were going, or they took the bus, a mile down the street. So I thought that was interesting, and why I think it is really about the neighborhood that you live in and what kind of accessibility opportunities are there. Is there public transit? Is there a bike lane that you feel comfortable using? So I think that that's not necessarily an answer to your question either, but I think it really is very specific to the neighborhood context. And I think most people are dealing with this by, as you said, not taking trips, by borrowing a car from a friend. And I think a lot of that kind of came up in these discussions, as well as previous research I've done with single moms who use public transit.
Actually, what was the gender split in the focus groups? I don't remember.
I should know. I don't think I brought a gender slide. We didn't have as much men participating here. I want to say it's maybe out of 86. I would think that something like 55 to 60 of them were women. Yeah.
What kind of, Nancy, what kind of past studies have been done, particularly that you could sort of pull from, and is there any sort of desire to take this and maybe either look backwards or try and do this again in a few years to sort of compare over time?
Yeah.
Thing to do with quantitative versus qualitative, but
Yeah. So let me think how I should answer. I think that there's a number of previous research that's been done, not necessarily I think trying to look at these spaces in which people move and tracking that. So we've been talking, Tara's really helpful in thinking about travel sheds as this concept. There's food sheds and there's different ways that people think about space and how do you kind of understand space in this kind of constrained way, but that there's people who live there. And so I think we're interested in kind of trying to look at previous research that's looked at, where are clusters of grocery stores and how are people accessing those. So I think maybe trying to put that in this context. Some of the things we've talked about doing are trying to look at, so if we've got all this spatial data in these neighborhoods, can we then, where are the bus stops? Can we kind of layer on to some of the GIS work? Here are where the bus stops are located, and here's how people are interacting with that space. So I think it's still, again, a real big work in progress. I think we're trying to put together a paper for urban geography, so I think we want to kind of speak to some of these themes around the geography of public spaces and how people interact with them. Yeah.
So you mentioned something about somebody felt like the public involvement process was too bureaucratic and didn't really get good outcomes. Were there any examples of better ways to improve that, or sort of more effective processes, or times when Portland got it right, kind of thing?
Yeah, it was interesting because it's fun as a researcher to go and be like, tell me everything that's terrible. And so I think sometimes I get much more data that's much more critical. I think that people were, the way that I approach this focus group is that I've done enough of these kind of qualitative projects in neighborhoods to be able to sort of say, okay, I get that this particular neighborhood, they're going to have these kinds of needs. And so it's on me if I want them to participate. I have to go to their neighborhood. I have to meet them where they're at. I have to do all the outreach in whatever format. Like in Cully, no one emails, so you have to physically call every single person and invite them. That's a totally different, it's much more labor-intensive method of outreach and getting people to participate. But at the same time, I mean, it pays off. I think it's kind of that being able to embed yourself in what it is that's happening in a particular community and then trying to figure out how to meet those needs. I think that it's hard sometimes for people who work and plan and think about the central city to conceptualize what it would be like to live in a space where you don't feel safe walking around on the street. And so I think that that challenge and that barrier makes it so that I think it's harder to do the outreach if you kind of live and work and play down here. So I think just kind of more like culturally sensitive and culturally aware approaches here are what works. And I think that the fact that we got so many people who typically don't engage with these questions to participate in these groups is kind of a testament to putting in that work on the kind of front end of things pays off. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Eva Maria. Nice meeting you finally. So I have a question. I love this qualitative work. That's something I never tackled with. But the one thing I'm wondering is that with that work, you are never able to get at the underlying factors that might confound what folks are talking about. For example, somebody who responds to, is concerned about bike safety, that might be somebody who's simply not comfortable on a bike, right? So they might not be comfortable riding on a painted bike which is bike lane, simply because it's just not, they just don't have that much of an experience. So that's what I'm a little concerned about. That's kind of shading their view in their responses. And that's what makes me wonder what to make of it. I don't know if you can respond to that.
Yeah, no, that's always a limitation, right? You don't necessarily know how are each of the people you're talking to kind of different in their own way. And you could imagine doing maybe a survey to get at some of these pieces to say, like, can we think about all of the ways that you're mobile and all of the ways that you don't feel comfortable being active or mobile. So I think that certainly ties into this story a lot, kind of what other variables are out there that are preventing people from biking or from taking public transit. I totally agree that that's a limitation. I don't necessarily know what I would say about how do you overcome that, or how do you really know, except to kind of continue to engage folks in these neighborhoods around these questions. I think that you read my report on like barriers to bicycling from women and minorities, and there's a lot of these very specific questions about like, it doesn't occur to many people to ride a bike when they've never seen another person of color in Portland riding a bike. So there's all these kind of like underlying issues about like, I don't see myself doing that thing, so it's crazy that you would ask why I would ride a bike, right? So I think that there's a lot of work in that report that I just finished writing that just got published earlier this week on the NITSE website. In that report, we talk really specifically about how there's like multiple levels at which we need to be working here. Like there's like the macro, like gender inequality and like, racism are problems, right? They like restrict how people move through public spaces. I don't expect the city of Portland to fix like, structural racism single-handedly, but I do think that there are things kind of at the like middle level here where we can say, well, we need to make these spaces feel more safe to lots and lots of different people. We need to change our signs so they have like a diverse group of people on them. I think there's all these kind of different like lower level ways in which you can get people to engage with public space, which doesn't necessarily attend to this question of like limitations of qualitative research, but I think that this is like, I see it as a series of ongoing discussions about how people move around. Yeah.
I just want to follow up on that. Even when we're doing more quantitative research, we don't know that either. So just because we can put a number on it doesn't mean we understand the underlying concept. So I'm going to make a plug for mixed methods.
Yes, mixed methods, absolutely. Yeah.
And it's sort of back to the comments about the geographies of these spaces. It's sort of the same thing. So if you live in a food desert, maybe that's perfectly fine because you could live right next door to a grocery store and not afford it or not like it, or it doesn't speak to your dietary needs. So just using these quantifiable metrics often don't tell you how satisfied people are with their transportation experience or how it's working for them. So I think the two together tell you the story that you want to hear.
Yeah.
Okay, so like there was the graph that showed the gentrification risk. So I have some questions, I guess. So I have sort of a basic idea about what gentrification is. It seems like most of the people here are like in this program or something, like studying this stuff. So looking at that map, like those, it's kind of hard for me to see like what streets the study went into.
Yeah.
But like I live in Gresham.
This is 205.
Okay.
Okay, so this is, if you live in Gresham, Gresham's right there.
Yeah, so that border of the like really darker red areas, like for like gentrification risk, does that mean that that's an area where prices are like rising higher than people can afford them, basically?
I do really encourage
you to read this report. But gentrification is a complicated thing, right? There's social things that happen. There's like cultural changes that happen. There are economic changes that happen. So I think broadly speaking, it's not just about how much is like housing costs or how much does rental prices increase. Where these neighborhoods become redder is because they may be in a place where it's more likely that people could get displaced because maybe the rents are starting to increase a little bit faster, or maybe, I forget who asked the first question, but sort of like, does it matter how close you live to good public transit, right? So neighborhoods that are kind of closer to transit centers are going to be more at risk than a neighborhood that's farther away. So it's a really complicated, it's also kind of historically very complicated to, like, how do you measure gentrification? Like, what is it? So I think there's lots and lots of debates about, like, is it, home, like median house price? Is it, how many people live in the neighborhood of a certain economic background? So there's lots of different ways to measure it. But this report's really, really great. Everybody read Lisa's work.
So I have another question. So I just have a hard time it's not intuitive for me what the importance of getting people into the central city is. So I'm just wondering why that would be a priority for the city, how, if it's an economic benefit or if it's just getting people feeling more connected, or...
Yeah, it's a really good question.
I mean, I personally, as you might be able to tell from this research, think it's much more important to get people moving in their own neighborhoods. I think a goal of everybody trying to come down to the central city is a little unrealistic, given how hard it is for people just to get around their own neighborhoods. So I don't know that that should necessarily be a goal. What I think that where these conversations around the Green Loop have come to, at least with me engaging with the city, is just to say, it's great if you build this thing in the central city, but be aware that you need to start, doing similar types of investments outside of the central city. Otherwise, you kind of run the risk of this feeling very unequitable or not something that is for everybody. So I think they're trying to now see this as sort of if you make an investment in the central city, what's the related or similar investment that might be able to happen out in other neighborhoods? I think that is. Well, still maybe not I would prefer to just build all the sidewalks. That's me. I just want sidewalks everywhere. But I think that there kind of has to be these sort of it's both things can happen, right? It's not we shouldn't make the central city nicer and deal with some of the challenges with our bike infrastructure down here. But we also shouldn't then say, well, people out in East Portland don't want bikes, and so we don't need to build bike infrastructure, right? I think you can do both of these things. You can invest simultaneously. Ideally, that's what I think.
Okay. So, it seemed like you were really focusing on trying to get minority and lower income input, with specifically in relation to walking and biking. Is that because there's generally more deterrence, or is it it seems from my perspective, if someone is going to be coming from a very a lower income area, they may not have the time necessary to be spending biking instead of driving or using public transit if there are better if there are more time efficient options for them. Is biking sort of an affordable sort of thing for people in not just money wise but time wise, and is that something that the putting in more biking and walking areas would promote?
Yeah, I mean, I think that
the motivation behind trying to get at more vulnerable populations is just that I think that historically it takes more time and more energy to get folks to be able to have the time to talk and to sit down and engage with this. And the city of Portland has not always had the time or the money or the resources to go out and do this kind of work. PSU and the Institute for Sustainable Solutions paid for this research, so it gave me a lot more flexibility and a lot more time to engage. And I think that that's really, really critical here. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that lots of people drive cars because it's more affordable sometimes, depending on how much parking costs, depending on a lot of different questions about public transit use and can you afford a $100 monthly pass, right? There's a lot of these kind of underlying questions about affordability that I think are part of this, and time is certainly a part of that equation. Yeah, if it's really time intensive for you to bike 7 miles to work, you're probably not going to do it because you're going to be tired and you've got to bike home. So those questions I think are really, really significant, but at the same time I think that at least in Lents, I think we have these conversations. Sorry, I keep pointing at Adam. These conversations we have in Lents are just, we don't necessarily think that people should always bike commute from the Lens neighborhood, the like 5 or 6 miles to downtown, but it would be great if they could feel like it was feasible for them to walk or bike to the grocery store that's there, or that they could go to the tool library that Green Lens has, right? Like there are some things in which it doesn't have to be like it's just about getting you from point A to point B in a commuter context, but like how can we save you time or increase the livability by investing in these kind of smaller scale infrastructures, sidewalks and bike lanes. Yeah.
On that point, I recently had to read the Foster Road Diet Plan, and I thought that argument that like connecting projects in Central City to a grander master plan, the argument that, for example, a project such as the Foster Road Diet will improve access to segregated or at least exclusive bicycle facilities, not shared lanes. The argument that improves the equity in that area is barely used. I feel it is in the project goals, which is interesting, but overall I feel like that's never integrated in the discussion. So I was wondering if maybe based on what your findings, that could be like improved. Is that something?
Yeah.
I think it would be great if any of these discussions had to come with some sort of assessment about equity, right? Like if you're going to turn Foster into 2 lanes, is it 2 lanes of traffic that the road diet is?
Yeah, it's 2 plus turn lane.
Yeah. So that's a significant change to that road that already is pretty high traffic during rush hour. But I think an equity consideration in relationship to that is really, really critical. Like, what does it mean to, I think that usually those types of assessments look at, like, businesses and what's going to be the impact on these businesses. But really is significant. Does doing something like this mean that people are going to start using side streets and that people feel unsafe because there's no sidewalks and now we're having traffic divert to the side streets around Foster? What does that mean for people's kind of livability or feelings of safety, which I think are particularly, acute when we're talking about that particular part of the city where there haven't historically been as many investments. So it's a good question. I would like to see these equity questions happen every single time we're talking about infrastructure. Yeah.
So I'm a little bit feeling like there's a disconnect here between how we're talking about the Central City and what folks are. Am I right in recalling that you said 1/3 of the people in these neighborhoods, Kenton, Coley, Powhurst, et cetera, are coming down to the Central City on a regular basis?
2/3 of them are not.
2/3 of the 1/3 are. From Kenton, from Coley. I wonder how that compares to the rest of the city, because they're coming from disparate locations with terrible transit, like we talked about, with very little access to bike lanes and the physical space there, even if you had good bike lanes to do it. And I think, I don't know, I would caution us from our perch here at the state's largest institution of higher learning that is in Central City, Portland, against underestimating the importance of downtown Portland to the city and the region. And it does seem to me, and I'd love like a benchmark with closer in neighborhoods. I would love a benchmark with more affluent people in those neighborhoods in terms of how many people are coming here. But for 1/3 of folks in those neighborhoods to be coming down here on a regular basis seems like a lot. And certainly there are opportunities there to look at how they're getting here and what can be done to reduce traffic in their neighborhoods locally and in the neighborhoods between here and there. But also, it seems like I don't want us to, because folks reasonably think there should be more investment in their own neighborhoods, correctly so. I don't think that there's been compelling evidence here that reduces the importance of investing in things like the Green Loop, which a lot of people have very strong and largely negative opinions on, but it's not even a thing. It's just this concept where, we're inviting people to make it out what they want it to be. That for 1/3 of people to be coming down here, I think that's certainly a pretty high number from those neighborhoods, and there's an opportunity there to look at how to do that differently and better. And I do think it's a both-end situation where we need to invest locally in these neighborhoods, but also acknowledge the uniqueness of the Central City for both the region and the city at large.
That's a great question.
Well, I think we're about out of time, so thanks for the engaging